Well, Taya, thank you very much for that tremendous introduction. And just to say to you, thank you again for hosting the event in that very room in which you're standing at the moment to introduce the Baltic Geopolitics Programme in Estonia. You've asked me today to talk about this book, The University Challenge. And I think the introduction by Alexander Stubbs was a perfect illustration of the central theme of this book. Where we start is that we are dealing with change in our world at a much faster pace than it's ever happened before. International competition, the geopolitical conflicts we've seen in relation to Russia and the Ukraine, the fourth industrial revolution, new technologies, artificial intelligence, new forms of work, cultural identities being challenged, the potential of women and youth being developed in many different ways, and the challenges of good governance. My point is that as the change is happening in the world, faster and faster, accelerating change, we all have to try and work out how we deal with this process of change and how we make it work for our benefit. And the fundamental argument that I make is that high-quality universities are absolutely central to our ability to do that. More than any other institutions, they can address the challenges and the issues with a frankness, a directness, and openness, whether it's about how people operate, whether it's about the development of the economy, whether it's the wider values, whether it's energy entrepreneurship, whatever it might be. It is universities who are the best possibility of making progress in this change. And so we argue in this book, The University Challenge, that there are four main contributions that universities make to dealing with the very rapid change, scientific change, technological change, society change, and so on. Firstly, to understand and interpret the process of change. We've got a very good example in what Alexander Stubbs was describing in his excellent presentation just now, trying to understand what is going on with Russia, how we deal with it, and how we move it forward for the future. A different type of challenge, which has dominated all our lives for 2 years, has been the challenge of COVID and the pandemic. How did we deal with that? What was going on? How did we get control of it? So going side by side with understanding and interpreting the process of change, universities also try to offer approaches that would harness the process of change for general benefit. So it's not just doing the analysis of what's happening, but thinking, well, how do we deal with this challenge of change that's happening to us? Again, universities are the best places to do that. But thirdly, universities educate and train to a very high quality the people, the specialist workers whose skills are necessary to address change properly. We have to ensure that people working throughout our societies are themselves equipped to deal with change and to handle it in whatever way they can. And then fourthly and finally, universities create a genuine, general, intellectually engaging climate and culture across societies that promotes the virtues of understanding in science. So we argue these four roles of the university: to understand and interpret change, to offer approaches to harness the process of change for general benefit, to educate and train people to high quality, and to create an intellectually engaging climate and culture, are the four contributions that universities can make to help us manage this process of change. And universities are far better placed to do that than are other potential organisations like government, corporate organisations, NGOs, whatever it might be. These all play important roles, but universities can and should bring together all the capacities. And I know you are discussing the question of university reform in Estonia, and I suggest to you that thinking about how Estonian universities can best be organised to do these four things well and effectively is extremely important. And I'm going to go through these things one by one. First of all, research, understanding and interpreting what is going on. The economy is obviously a key thing. The way that the fourth industrial revolution is developing, the way that people will be able to work together, the way that we have our trade relationships in the existing world, the kind of European conjuncture which Alexander was discussing in his presentation are key points. Obviously, the world of work has transformed. Even under COVID, we've had the change of the location of people's work. Where is it going to be? Is it going to be in town and city centres? Is it going to be more from home, more virtual? Have we got more people coming into the workplace, people working later in life, more people who weren't traditionally working coming to work in our societies? How are our societies being organised in whatever way? And then looking at our culture and history. So the research itself is a very important aspect of the way in which we can move forward. And the element that is so important about this is not simply to understand what is going on, but to harness our understanding to the general good of society. Change is not of itself a good thing. It's not necessarily certain that change will benefit everybody. Many changes do not benefit people. So the question that arises is, how can you make the change work to benefit the society as a whole? How can you focus on problem solving and knowledge about how to address change? These are tough challenges, but they are essential if we are to not simply be swept aside by a process of change which we're not able to influence or control. That requires a whole series of strong relationships between universities, employers, public and private. It requires an analysis of the necessary skills. It requires local research and knowledge transfer. It requires university contribution to public and governmental ambitions. And it requires promoting research networks. Now, it'll be obvious to you that not all universities do actually have those kind of network relationships across society. The old word was ivory tower, sometimes a university working in a very isolated way, with the scholars working almost like the traditional monks that they were in medieval universities, looking at themselves and not looking into the wider society. We argue that for the modern universities, in Estonia, as everywhere else, it's a question of having a wide range of strong relationships with a wide range of different organizations, employers, government, professional organizations, and so on. I'm glad to say that the Estonian universities that I'm familiar with are in fact behaving in that way, are having strong, wider relationships with employers. They're not putting their heads in the sand and only looking at themselves, but are trying to encourage a wide range of different relationships. But that ability to harness research to the general benefit is absolutely centrally important in how one can take things forward. So I come to the third aspect of universities, which I mentioned earlier, providing high quality education and training. Now, this is a big, big challenge. It should be obvious that just as the world of work is changing so very quickly itself all the time, so the nature of being a worker is changing. The skills you require are changing. The capacities to be able to work in this new world are changing. Just to give one example, if you're a teacher these days, it's no good simply being trained to teach and finish your qualification at the age of 21 and then spend the next 40 years teaching on the basis of those same qualifications. You've got to be able to update your skills to teach using technologies, distance learning, a whole set of other techniques, and most important of all, in a way that you understand as a teacher the wider society that you're teaching about. The same is true of health workers, the same is true of industrial workers, the same is true of government workers. This is all changing very rapidly. And there has to be a mechanism for ensuring that people who are now working in this rapidly changing environment are able to benefit from it properly. So that means flexibility in offering new modes of study, new structures of courses, and new modes of delivery. For example, it's not obvious that the traditional front-loaded model of education, where you did most of your higher education at the beginning of your life and then not much else through the rest of your life, that's not really fitted for the world of today. You have to have a position where people aged 35, 55 are able to do the courses they need, learn them in different ways, come in from different backgrounds, not simply what I call the escalator that takes you from school straight into university, but also a whole set of other ways of being able to provide courses, modular forms of delivery, and so on. And that is not easy. It requires, for example, I have the second bullet point on this slide, agreement to a system of accreditation with relevant professional bodies. So that if you are going to be qualified to act as a health worker or as an accountant or as an architect or whatever, it's not just one form of training as a health worker, an accountant, an architect, but looking at other forms of training that people can acquire to be able to get the accreditation to be able to practice professionally. It requires, as I've already said, retraining, updating, continuous professional development in all disciplines. Fortunately, online continuous professional development is now very well developed, and it does enable people to be able to refresh their skills and take them forward in an effective and positive way. Pastoral care, that means not simply casting the student of whatever age onto the scrap heap and saying, okay, you sort it out. It means listening to them, understanding what they're looking for, understanding what they're trying to achieve, understanding how they might balance their education with other responsibilities, other work responsibilities, other family responsibilities, other caring responsibilities, to ensure that people can do the things together in parallel, which is not at all easy. And of course, access and pre-university courses to try and give genuine educational opportunities to people who are coming to university from non-traditional forms of learning. These are all big and complicated things which require the universities to think very hard about how they provide their education to people in the most effective kind of way. And the fourth element of what universities have to do is establishing an intellectual climate in the country, a strong intellectual climate, which means that questions can be discussed. The kind of lecture which Alexander Stubbs just gave needs to be something which promotes discussion across the whole of society about how we deal with these challenges. It's not simply a question for a particular elite, in parliamentarians or whoever it may be. It's a question of engaging the society widely in a strong intellectual climate which can discuss these problems in an effective way. It requires issues of leadership and governance, issues of diverse and respectful university communities, involving local civic and community engagement. So it's not just the university, but also the municipality, also the employers, also the businesses and whoever. And having a clear local community strategy to try and see how the way goes forward. One of the consequences of globalization, whether world globalization or the kind of regional globalization that Alexander was discussing just then, is that communities can be left behind as traditional forms of economic production end up being put on one side. Universities can be and should be a major form of being able to regenerate that in good ways. Now, how do you pay for all this? I've identified the four functions of universities, but the key question is, how do you actually pay for all this? There are a number of potential payers for this. They are the state, the individual student, an employer, philanthropy, international support. Various people can pay. And in many countries, it's a massive debate, the extent to which individual students pay. I know that in Estonia, there have been a number of discussions of this over the last 8 years with different issues about how to take it forward. I introduced this in the UK in 2004, which it wants to improve education in the country, be focusing the state's resources on primary education or preschool education, or should it be focusing on university education? There are moral issues about who are the beneficiaries, financially speaking, of university education, and so on. You will debate these things in Estonia, and I'm very interested to hear the later session by Mr. Vablane, the expert from the Foresight Centre on future scenarios for higher education in Estonia. I will not trespass on what he is going to talk about, but the questions you have to address are: what is the most just, most effective way of paying for university education? And then, can you do it in a socially just way? The American system of student fees is not socially just and basically is a private sector operation. The UK system, people pay back through the tax system. They pay an extra 9% of tax through their working life out of the higher incomes that they receive as a result of having got a university qualification, and until their loan is paid off. There are different ways of dealing with these things, and each country will form its different approach. One of the striking things about this, actually, which is surprising to me when I wrote this book, is the very varied number of types of financing system which exist in different countries. But it's of course true that if you're going to have properly funded universities, resilient in their financial support, able to do the research that's necessary, able to educate and train at the highest level, and so on, they need to be properly resourced. And that therefore requires a frank conversation about who at the end of the day is benefiting from this and who at the end of the day will pay for it. The final point I want to make before my closing slide is about universities and their partners. I mentioned earlier that I thought universities in Estonia are strong in not being ivory towers, not simply looking at themselves, but being widely linked. And I think that's a strength of Estonian universities. Also, I would say, speaking of my country, of UK universities as well, though they're parts of the UK university system which are very self-absorbed. But universities need partnerships, because if you're dealing with change, if you want to understand change, local change, regional change, international change, in a particular town, in the Baltic area, more widely, you need to have partners who you can have dialogue with about the changes which are taking place and try and understand them. Because without those dialogues, you can't really think about them in an effective way. You similarly need partners to chart the challenges of the future. So to talk to employers about the industrial techniques of the future, to talk to government and politicians about how governments are going to work, to provide the skills of the future, to develop creativity, intelligence, cultural activity, and all the time to be focused on building the resilience of the society, resourcefulness, innovation, and promoting the values of a strong society. These are all things which universities can do far better if they are working with other people in partnerships, rather than working, as I say, in an isolated way. So to summarize what I'm trying to present and what we argue in this book, how do you make it happen? First and most important is to focus on the future, not the past. Historically, many universities have focused on the past, teaching about the past, but not projecting forward into the future. And it does require a mindset to project forward in the future, to understand about how change is happening, how it's coming. It requires consistent focus and leadership in universities, always to be looking forward, always to be focusing on understanding the change that can be made. It requires wide support and engagement of universities, and it requires the range of partnerships which I've previously discussed. Taya, I've tried to present in these presentation the kind of ideas of the book. They can be applied to a large number of different challenges of change, including that which Alexander Stubbs just presented. And of course, I'm happy to discuss it with you now in whatever way you think best.
Yeah, thank you so much. Indeed, we've got time for some questions, luckily. And thank you for the wonderful presentation that gave a good context, a great context to the debates being held in Estonia currently. And there are some questions from the audience. And the first one is actually about, if I a bit kind of edit this, it's about, should we fund universities or should we fund directly the students? Well, the question is that as the lifelong learning gets much more attention, needs to get much more attention, so perhaps we should sponsor, instead of universities, we should sponsor the students who take different courses, online ones, and perhaps going also to foreign universities. Why only to concentrate on funding the universities if we could directly fund the students and create much more, some would say, much more competitive market?
Well, we made the change in the UK to make this shift to funding students and not funding universities. And it was very controversial. It's essentially a change that says the state helps the student who then has to pay the university for the course that they do. Now, quite apart from issues of social justice, the central benefit of that is it makes sure that universities are independent organisations. They're not relying on a cash handout from the government. That creates more independence for the universities, which in turn gives them the intellectual creativity and flexibility, both to use your word, Tia, to serve the market which they're serving, the students who are studying, and to make sure they're providing courses which are genuinely of benefit to the students. But secondly, to have the independence of mind to be able to look at changes without waiting for an instruction from government. Now, the culture of different universities across Europe is very, very different here. There are a number of countries where there's a very strong centralised government direction of the process. I don't think that's a good idea. I think independent universities need to be created, and the best way to achieve that is to fund the students, then to pay for the universities if the universities are providing the courses which are providing benefits to the students. But as I say, that's a controversial change, and I favour the implication of the question that the funding should go to the students. And then the universities get their economic support by providing courses which students want to study, and so they get their resilience in that way. But it's not a straightforward question, because there's plenty of people in governments who say, well, actually, we want to control universities. At the end of the day, the purse strings are very important, but I think that's a backward way of looking at things.
Well, thank you. Very thorough. Another question is about, as you elaborated so well, that the universities need to be informed of the needs of the society, or the needs of the business, to be ready to offer the education of the future, not the education of the past. So in Estonia, there is this rather new initiative of creating boards at the universities, and the board members are basically from business. So this is kind of a business community directly related to the university, to advise the university in terms of curricular development, etc. But now the kind of dilemma has emerged that the boards represent the interests of businesses in the universities, but how to make these boards also to represent the interests of universities in front of the government? What would you say to this?
That's a very good question. Firstly, I think the idea of boards is a good one. If you say it's not simply the university, but a wider community, then the question comes, well, who's on the boards? Is it just businesses? Is it the local community? Could it be the municipality? Might it be community organisations and voluntary organisations? Are the students themselves in some way represented on the boards? Are the academic staff represented on the board? So I think there's a full discussion you need to have about who are the boards and how that operates, including it's possible to have government representatives on the boards as well, but to have a wide range of people. You made a very good point when you introduced it about what do these boards do, and they should, exactly as you said, be talking about what education is taking place at the universities, what the curricula are covering, what they are trying to address. And that's not always easy, because there are plenty of academic staff who say, actually, I know best, leave it to me, I don't want any interesting contributions from somebody else, I'm the person to do it. And one has to change the state of mind, in my view, to say that these boards and the various component parts of them can themselves contribute to the way that universities operate and what they do. Now, on your point about the universities related to government, well, actually, the boards ought to strengthen the university's relationship to government, because if the universities and the boards are interrelating well, when there is some kind of issue that arises with the government, then the board will help the university make its argument to government, whether it's for more research funding in particular areas or opening up new kinds of courses or whatever it might happen to be. So I would say that a board strengthens the university in its capacity to represent whatever it needs to directly to government.
In Estonia, we have a free of charge education, higher education, as long as the student fulfills the curriculum in full amount in due time. So, given your points about the lifelong learning and the variety emerging among students, that they tend perhaps not to be anymore so much the people just graduating the high school and going straight to the university. So, do you think the funding model that we've got, that the higher education is free, but only as long as the curriculum is completed fully, which means that you can't really do studying while working, because then you would probably lag behind of the in-time completion of curriculum. Do you think this system that we have is reasonable? Does it look reasonable to you?
Well, to be honest, I'm always very skeptical about the word free. Who in life gets things free? The answer is nobody gets things free. Somebody is paying for it. And if somebody gets a free higher education, well, somebody is paying. Who is paying? The university teachers, the facilities, and so on. Well, somebody is. And the question I raise is, who should this be? Firstly, from the point of view of the state, is it the best thing that the state is putting money into universities or into primary schools or nursery? We decided in the UK that university funding was a lower priority than preschool education and primary, because there's a lot of argument that if you put investment into children, young people earlier on, then they do better. But if that means you end up with not so much money going from the state into the universities, then the universities wither. So my answer to your question is I would be looking in your case to charging a fee to students to go to universities in Estonia, but then looking for a fair system of repayment. So the question is, if you have got a degree and you're working as an engineer, do you pay back later? In our system, with our pay-as-you earn taxation system, people can pay back for, say, 20 years, and they do pay back. And it actually happens because there's a lot of evidence that if you've done the university course, you get paid better later in life, and you're able to do it. So my answer to your question was it would be better if students paid themselves, but with a fair repayment system, which meant that those who couldn't afford to repay were not forced to do so.
Great. Please excuse my ignorance, but what's the tax rate to pay back the higher education loans in UK?
9%. You pay 9% of your
9% of the
your
income. Okay.
income tax. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that information. Perhaps one last question, if you allow me. Do you think that the meaning of the higher education is changing? We've used to think that this is something that we need to offer to the highly qualified labor force only, based on the labor demand on the market. But would it perhaps move towards the direction that higher education is an asset for a person to have a more meaningful life and to have kind of more fulfillment in his or her doings? Should we perhaps, I know UK is aiming for 50% higher educated people in the population. Should we aim for more?
Well, I completely agree with the implication of your question. The days when university education was restricted to a small group of professionals, I think, are gone. We're towards 50% of the population in the UK. Countries like Finland are well over 50% of the population. There is a discussion to be had about what does a university education mean, what are you learning when you're at university, and so on. But I definitely think enabling people over a much longer period, a much wider range of people, to have an education is necessary. Why? For the reason I said in the introduction of my talk. The world is changing very fast. And everybody needs to be able to handle this rapid process of change. And that requires education for them to be able to do that. And understanding whether it's the geopolitical questions of the type that we heard from Alexander Stubbs, or the scientific transformations, or the COVID, or whatever it might be, the fourth industrial revolution. For all of these, the situation is that people need to be educated. And so universities, I would say the meaning of university education is changing.
Thank you so much for these very clear views and great advice. And thank you for your time. I very much appreciate you could join us virtually today. Unfortunately, we go further in Estonian. So you mentioned you would like to listen the presentation of Uku Varblane. It will be in Estonian. Anyway, you are welcome to receive afterwards an English transcription. I'll provide it to you. So thank you so much and have a great day. And let's hope we'll see you again.
Thank you very much indeed, Tara. I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to getting the English transcript of the next presentation. Many thanks.
Thank you.